Good evening, everyone. We've got an interesting evening ahead of us, so thank you for joining us. I'm Karen Storwick. I'm with RAUSI, the Royal Alberta United Services Institute. And for those of you who are new to RAUSI, we were founded about 100 years ago after the First World War as a think tank. And RAUSI evolved into a veterans organization over the years. And more recently, we've been evolving back into a think tank, and we have become a Canadian-based forum for sharing ideas, trends in global security and defense issues. I'd like to introduce you to Qentin Innis, Major Retired Qentin Innis, who's been with the Canadian Armed Forces for 37 years, Qentin. Most of those years as a Patricia. So Qentin will introduce our special guest this evening.
Thank you, Karen, for that intro. As advertised, I'm Qentin Innis. Spent most of my career in the Patricias, and one of the things I did while I was there was I served with the Canadian Airborne Regiment, and that's where I met your guest for tonight, Major General Retired Chip Chapman. Chip joined the British Army in 1980 as a para. He fought in the Falklands as a platoon commander in 2 para, and his early career was spent mostly in Northern Ireland dealing with terrorism, counter-terrorist tasks. He commanded 2 para, 1999 to 2001, and his final years were spent working counterterrorism issues for the Brits. His last job was as the senior British military advisor to United States Central Command in Tampa, Florida. He retired from the military in 2013. Post-military, Chip authored a book, Notes from a Small Military, and the Chapman Review, a strategic analysis of police discipline in England and Wales. Chip is a regular talking head on British media. He speaks as an analyst and a commentator on terrorism, radicalization, and more lately, the Ukraine. We're very fortunate to have Chip with us here tonight. Chip's a brilliant man who can bring together threads and weave the threads into a coherent whole. He's got about 40 minutes of prepared material, and then we'll take your questions at the end. Without further ado, Chip, I'll turn over to you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for that. Where to start? I have got my Canadian wings and I've got my Russian wings, so I'm one of the few people in the world. But the start point really is when Maggie Thatcher came to the British Staff College just before she was kicked out. And the Balkans is just about to kick off. And Margaret Thatcher goes up to the commandant of the Staff College, a guy called Mike Rose, who commanded the SAS in the Falklands War, and said, "General Rose, what should we do about the Balkans?" And Mike Rose said, "Well, Prime Minister, it's not really a vital interest. It's not really a major interest. It's maybe a bit of a minor interest. We might deliver a bit of humanitarian aid and a few blankets." But to quote Bismarck at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, "It's really not worth the bones of a Pomeranian grenadier." Margaret Thatcher said, "How dare you? We should bomb the bridges. We should bomb the infrastructure. We should really take it to that evil dictator Milosevic." And Mike Rose was handbagged by the Prime Minister. The next week, the Secretary of State for Defense is coming to the Staff College. He says to Mike Rose, "General Rose, what do you think we should do about the problems in the Balkans and Bosnia and Serbia?" General Rose, being a wise general, says, "Well, Secretary of State for Defense, I think we should bomb the bridges. We should bomb the infrastructure. We should really take it to that evil dictator, Milosevic." And the Secretary of State for Defense says, "Are we promoting madmen to be generals these days?" Now, the point of that story is really fourfold. Firstly, that consistency in politics is the hallmark of a shallow mind. But in relation to Ukraine, leaders may change, vital interests rarely change, and geography never changes. So let's start by looking at those things. Now, Putin has been in power effectively since 1999, 24 years. Yes, I know that Medvedev was there for 4 years, but he was really a poodle of Putin. Now, the key thing about that, in a sense, is that that is twice as long as Adolf Hitler was in power from 1933 to 1945. So during that time, he has had the opportunity to both consolidate his rule, crush dissent, crush the liberal press, and really hack people's minds. And effectively, that's what he's doing. And at the moment, we're at Putin 4.0. Unless something goes wrong, we're going to be there until 2036 with Putin 6.0. Now, that's not to say that leaders won't change, because leaders do change, as Maggie Thatcher was kicked out of office shortly after the story I told. But are you going to get someone who is a lot different than Putin who might take over? The answer to that is probably not. And if you look at Medvedev, for example, Medvedev has really become he's not one of the candidates, I would say, to take over should Putin actually go. Medvedev in the current Ukrainian-Russia invasion has really become the sort of rhetorical general-in-chief, and his last missive which should have been picked up more widely by the world press in April, said that no one in the world needs Ukraine, therefore it will cease to exist and should be raised from the map. Now, that is just not something in diplomatic discourse that you would normally say is normal behavior in modern times, but that won't change. So leaders may change, but the regime in terms of its outlook, trying to break away from the West, will probably not change. So I then said that vital interests rarely change. So what are the perception of Russia's vital interests from their perspective? Well, at the grand strategic level, the first thing is that they see themselves as a need to regain lost territories and spheres of influence. And you may recall that at the Munich Security Conference in 2006, Putin said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. And he means that. So regaining lost territory and spheres of influence is a given for him. The second grand strategic interest from the Russians is to reestablish Russia as a great power. The third one to do that is to diminish US influence globally. That would then lead on to a number of strategic objectives from the Russian perspective, which include dividing and deterring NATO, dividing and weakening the EU, and increase leverage over the US and its allies. Now, I would argue that it was actually the Western movement of Ukraine towards the EU in 2014, rather than any notion of moving towards NATO. That was the key problem for Russia, because the notion of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, being infected by Western civilization, which is again a great theme that we're playing on at the moment, is pretty paramount. They do see themselves as disconnecting from the Western world at the moment, and that sui generis, that there is something completely different in the Russian mindset. So those really are the vital interests as I see them, from the sort of main ones from the Russian perspective. If you flip that coin, then from a Ukrainian perspective, of course, they then want to join the EU. They want to lean towards the West. They want to join NATO. And more importantly, at the moment, they want to regain their sovereignty under the 1991 borders. Now, again, I would argue that there's a lot of conspiracy theories about the Maidan Revolution in 2014 and Yanukovych, but most of that, in a way, is the people were revolting because they saw Yanukovych as someone who wanted to be the master of the people, and they wanted a leader as someone who could be the servant of the people. So all this stuff about a US coup, I think, is largely sort of nonsense. So that's that sort of stuff. And in terms of this restore lost territory and spheres of influence, it was very quickly evident in the invasion. By the 10th of March, one of the interlocutors, which also comes back to the notion that leaders change, one of the early interlocutors was Naftali Bennett, who was at that stage the Prime Minister of Israel. Of course, he's gone since then, as is the British Prime Minister, and we've got Netanyahu. But as the interlocutor by the 10th of March, it was the message he was to relay to Zelensky at the time was of total victory and unconditional surrender. And that really is the maximalist position from a Russian perspective. The problem they've got, of course, at the moment is that they've got a minimalist army with maximalist objectives, and that is part of their problem. But being no doubt that there is still that maximalist objective, and that the theory of victory from a Russian perspective is this sort of long war and outliving the West, who will tire of Ukraine, and that the Ukraine narrative will be put into the back seat, and we'll all get sort of cheesed off by supporting Ukraine with financial, military, and humanitarian support. Now, I get this quite often when I go on, for example, some TV programs where the cost of living crisis in the UK is deemed to be something that those right-wing commentators, as well as left-wing commentators, purely don't get this. So if leaders change, but vital interests rarely change. The third thing I would mention about is geography never changes. Geography is unchanging, and that will provide a problem when we look towards any conclusion of the war in terms of how we go from conflict termination to conflict resolution. And of course, there are lots of theories about demilitarized zones and things like that for the future. Of course, geography can be altered, as in terms of if you blow up things like the Kharkova Dam, but in the notion of how you get from a truce to a ceasefire to an armistice and through to a peace settlement, there's a lot along that line. And someone like me would, of course, argue that the Kharkova Dam destruction, which I almost certainly think was done by the Russians, was an act of ecocide, a war crime under Article 56, Additional Protocol 1 to the 1976 Additional Protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Now, the title of this sort of presentation was about war and warfare. So, of course, we need to distinguish between the two to know what we're really talking about. And war, of course, is the political objectives for which war is fought. And one of the things I'd also argue at the moment is that the strategy bridge between political power and military intent has been far better from the Russian side than it has, far better on the Ukrainian side than it has on the Russian side, certainly in terms of the unity of command that you see in Ukraine and the disunity of command that you see in Russia, particularly with the Prigozhin and the use of private military companies, the Wagner Group and things like that, not all working towards a common framework with a common strategy bridge between politics and the military. So the object of war, therefore, in Little Heart's sort of definition really is a better peace. But like all these things, it's from whose perspective and whose rules get to apply. Now, the Russians, as I said, really quite content with a forever war, that they'll outlive the sort of West in terms of their resolve. But it's really not a war that the West can afford to lose, or Ukraine. Now, of course, it's a truism that if Russia stops fighting, then the war is finished. But if Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine is finished. That is, this is absolutely existential from a Ukrainian perspective, in the way it is not existential from a Russian perspective. It might be existential from the position of the Kremlin. And of course, if you were to look at intelligence yardsticks, you can also argue that there are centripetal forces at work in Russia, because the Russian Federation has 22 non-Russian republics, and there are forces there that if there was a really bad strategic defeat for the Russian Federation, that could rip Russia apart. And certainly when I was doing a lot of work, and I spent a lot of time at Salisbury during the Novichok attack 4 or 5 years ago, one of the things I argued then, that one of the predominant trends in Russia at that time, and one of the predominant phrases, was no future. And that is why a large number of the educated youth were leaving it in those times, because they saw the indicators in terms of GDP and population and all those things going downwards, south. And there was a talk at that time that the real fear was of civil war in 5 or 10 years' time. And I started really with sort of Bosnia and the Balkans. And one of the worst outcomes you could argue would be a Bosnia with nukes if that were to happen. So I'd argued 5 years ago that we needed to engage Russia. And that really comes down to how you posit what sort of peace you might go to the future. at the end of this war. Now, the worst two options, in a way, the first one is a frozen peace, going towards some ceasefire that rewards the aggressor. And that is absolutely, at the moment, one of the options that Russia would want to do, because in terms of the Duma and the Constitution, we all know that they've illegally annexed not only Crimea, but Zaporizhia, Kherson, Luhansk, and Donetsk. So a frozen peace would be disastrous. That is essentially is what they tried to do with the Minsk II Accords, and the Minsk II really founded on definitions of what sovereignty was to be. From a Ukrainian perspective, of course, Minsk II meant a ceasefire with Russia leaving all the territory of Ukraine. And then you could talk about the issues of Luhansk and Donetsk. From a Russian perspective, it was seen as a way to break the sovereignty of Ukraine. The second thing, which is very related to that in terms of the peace, is this notion of land for peace. Again, that would reward the aggressor. And if you believe in the morals and ethics of war, that's not something that you should do. And of course, the UN Charter, because the UN Charter really is interesting if you look at it in terms of Article 2, brackets 4, close brackets. Doesn't actually ask nations to resist from going to war. It doesn't tell nations the times they should go to war. It only has two occasions when you can go to war. The first one is if it's authorized by a UNSCR, which this isn't. And the second one is in Article 51 in self-defense. Of course, that's what Ukraine is fighting about. It's self-defense because it's actually been invaded. The third one, which relates to this notion of what sort of defeat should there be one, strategic or operational, of the Russians, is what I term the Carthaginian peace. Now, of course, Carthaginian peace is to do with Carthage, the end of the Third Punic War, when all notions of the Carthaginian society were, crushed into the ground, no legacy left in history. If you believe some of the myths, that in fact they rubbed salt into the agricultural land of the Carthaginians so that nothing could grow in the future. Now, interestingly, that is apparently a myth, but at the moment I'm reading I, Claudius by Robert Graves. He mentions that on page 3, in fact, about the Carthaginian peace and being rubbed into salt. So in terms of mythology, I do wonder if it came from Robert Graves. I, Claudius was published in 1934. The other two types of peace really are a just peace and a sustainable peace. A just peace from a Ukrainian perspective would be that they reclaim their sovereignty and that Russia has some peace settlement with them that allows them to, go towards their aspirations of either EU membership or NATO membership. Now, again, in terms of some of the initial thoughts by March, April last year were really to do with not NATO membership, but to do with notions of neutrality, which can be something which pertains in international relations and in fact does for Austria. But you really need 3 things for a sustainable neutrality. Firstly, you need the ability to trade space for time. So, at the moment they can do that with where the Dnipro River is, the left side of the river. Secondly, you need large armed forces, which the Russians won't allow them to do. And thirdly, you need some security guarantees. But post 1991, Ukraine had lots of security guarantees, of which the most prevalent one that people talk about is the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when they gave up their nuclear weapons for a security guarantee from both UK and the US. So is it a forever war? Well, you have to then look at how why fighting stops. And fighting, of course, stops for 1, 2, or 3 reasons. 1, because of decisive military victory. Secondly, because of the improbability of military victory. Or thirdly, because of the unacceptable costs, either military, economic, political, essentially what Russia are trying to do with the deep battle and tried with the deep battle last year in terms of degrading and destroying the energy infrastructure of the Ukrainians. Incredible recovery from that to the point where Ukraine are actually exporting energy at the moment. So amazing. And I don't think in history you can see a deep battle which has really been successful. And most of the time I quote the Casablanca declaration in 1943, which led to the strategic bombing in the Second World War, which didn't actually achieve anything. There's absolutely this difference then between war, political reasons that you fight, and warfare, the art of fighting. And of course, one of the things that the Russians got wrong absolutely at the start was they didn't really understand that key variable in warfare, which is, will the Ukrainians fight? How well will they fight? And for how long will they fight? Because we all know that there's two parts to war. There's a physical part, but more importantly, there's a psychological part, that thing which is very difficult to measure. And total means multiplied by your strength of will gives you your power of resistance. And that is absolutely strong in the Ukrainians at the moment. Now, the doctrine people in the UK in the early part of the 21st century looked at the key things which led to success in land warfare in the 20th century and came up with 4 factors for success. The first one was control of the air, the second one was shock action, the third one was surprise, and the fourth one was offensive recce. Now, once shock and surprise have dissipated, which they do after a period of time, you generally get to a state of entropy. That is, that after the initial shock or surprise, things regress to a norm when you can measure the how much stock, kit, equipment you will need, the rates of consumption, the rates of advance when you get to this condition when shock and surprise have gone. What we really see at the moment in the offensive by the Ukrainians is this trade-off between the control of the air from the Russians and offensive recce, the fourth factor which led to success in land operations in the 20th century, with the Ukrainians trying to use that offensive recce to ultimately pull their maneuver forces through to try and lead ultimately to a win big and a quick win now. Now that's not playing out at the moment because of the fact that it's difficult to do without air superiority. If you go back to example to Desert Storm in 1991, you only really started phase 3, the ground operations, in 1991, after you'd had phase 1, a strategic air campaign, and phase 2, a short, intense effort to establish air superiority over the Kuwait theatre of operations. So in terms of doing this, you're trying to do an offensive operation to reclaim all of your sovereign territory and win big without air superiority, and that's going to be really, really difficult to do. So at the moment, there's 2 ends of control of the air and this offensive recce to bring your forces through. It's the real big tension, and we see that playing out in the clashes that we're seeing at the moment in a number of ways. Firstly, in the electronic warfare battle against the drones. Now, incredibly, the figure which is being quoted for the number of drones being lost from the Ukrainians is 10,000 a month. Now, you might think that that is a huge number, and of course it is, but you need to look at what the sort of rubric of drones are these days, or when they talk about unmanned aerial systems or whatever, because really they're on 5 levels. There's the micro drones, there's the small drones, there's the tactical drones, there's the medium drones, and there's the high-end drones, your sort of predators and stuff like that. And all those are caveated by size, range, speed, or mission. So when we talk about 10,000 drones being lost, most of those, of course, are quadcopters. That is really the hobbyist type drones, which is being modified to carry, a 2-pound weapon, and quite a lot of those are sort of first-person view drones. So it is those which are being lost, not the high-end sort of stuff. So that's the first battle which is really going on, electronic warfare versus the drones. And that is why quite a lot of the Ukrainian deep battle is posited as trying to destroy quite a lot of the high-end electronic warfare kit of the Ukrainians. The second battle, of course, is the air defense battle against the Russian drones or helicopters. And in terms of the NATO terminology, it's, I know people keep on quoting Ka-52, but really it's the Hokums and Hinds from the NATO nomenclature that we kind of used to use. So there, the third one, of course, is that the helicopters and the drones against the armored of the Russians. So none of this is new in terms of combined arms warfare. It needs that complete package of armored infantry, air defense, engineers, artillery, and now sort of vertical envelopment with the drones to be successful. But I don't really care if you call the drones ISTAR, intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, or control of the air, but I like to call it part of the control of the air battle. It's the third dimension, and really we've seen the devolution of the of air power in that sort of sense, where that is where the notion of seeing and knowing what is over the hill, the Napoleonic thing, is now far easier to do with the fact that that sort of capability has been rolled out. So it's where those capability mismatches are in the offensive operations of Ukraine that will determine how far they go and how quickly they can innovate to ensure that they cover those gaps if there are any. And that does worry me also in terms of the sort of Russian deep battle, because a lot of the stuff that the Russians are doing in the close battle is because they've been able to maximize the air power. They haven't lost that much air power. One of the points that General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, made about 6 weeks ago to the House Armed Services Committee, but they also have enough air power to do air interdiction. And it also worries me about what we used to call the sort of air interdiction in terms of bringing your forces to bear and follow-on forces attack the brigade at sort of 24 hours away from the battlefield, division at 42, the corps at 72 in NATO terminology in a way. So really what I'm saying here is that the nature of war has not changed. That's, it's always been visceral and people get killed and all that sort of stuff. That's not changed. Has the character changed? It's too early to really say that the character of war has changed and what has been revealed to us. And I say that for two reasons and look back at two wars to sort of really illustrate this. The first one is the Nagorno-Karabakh confrontation of September 20. Now, in that confrontation, which lasted 44 days against Azerbaijan, against Armenia, that was the first war in history that most of the battle damage was caused by unmanned systems. That is the unmanned aerial systems, the drones, and essentially Armenia were very poor and Azerbaijan really were very good, enabled by the Turks using a lot of TB2 Bayraktars. And that is, of course, something that we heard a lot about in supporting the Ukrainians in the early days, that has really fallen off the radar because of this electronic warfare versus the drone sort of battle. And that really comes back to, that is a tactical drone, not these micro or small drones, which is the majority of the ones being used in the close battle at the moment. So people extrapolated from that war that unmanned aerial systems were going to be the thing which did most of the battle damage in future history. No, that's not really the case. I don't think. It is still artillery as the god of war. The last figure I saw yesterday was that the Ukrainians are firing 110,155 shells a month, and the Russians are firing 4 times that, somewhere around 440,000 shells a month. So artillery is still the god of war, it seems to me. The second war, which is worth looking at, or I looked at, was in Gaza, the May 21 Guardians of the War of the Walls, the Israeli Gaza conflict. And that is also been deemed the first AI war, artificial intelligence war, where the Israelis used the power of machine learning, artificial intelligence to fuse both in interfusion and satellites from two of their particular units, Unit 82,000 or 8200 and Unit 9900, for targeting purposes in real time, looking at historic data, using that power to find out where the systems were. Now, this is one of the things that I don't think we know enough about in certainly open source things, but I think the power and speed and agility of the Ukrainian targeting is something that will come out in time at the end of this war, enabled a lot by the Americans, and particularly one of the things which has come to the fore here, which is the commercialization of the battle space in a way, because a lot of the support that the Ukrainians have got in targeting is from commercial organizations, American ones, Palantir, Maxar Technologies, Planet, Capella Strip Space, Primer. And again, although we now talk about the 5 domains of war, so not only the land, sea and air, but cyber and space, I think a lot of American space power has been enabled the targeting of the Ukrainians to good effect, which is why it's far more successful than the Russian targeting has been. Now, again, if you were to look at those 2 wars that I just mentioned, one of which lasted 44 days and one that lasted 7 days, you might say, well, all wars are going to be short. But one of the other things which I think is very instructive to look at the future is what General Mark Milley said, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, I know Mark Milley. The last course I did in the Army was the Pinnacle course in America, the strategy course. And wasn't largely picked up at the time, but in 2017, a couple of years before he became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he produced an article in the Military Times, which it was 5 myths we need to let go about war. And they were, first myth, wars will be short. They might not be, and that's what we're seeing playing out at the moment. And that means quite a lot in terms of how Western societies look at warfare, particularly in terms of regeneration and reconstitution, both in terms of the industrial base as well as the military base. The second myth, SF can do it all. They can't. The third myth, you can win wars from afar just by dropping ordnance, a deep battle. You can't. The fourth myth, armies fight wars. They don't. Nations fight wars. And that, again, was one of the mistakes that the Russians made very early on. 3 principal mistakes. One, how good they thought the Russian army were. Secondly, how bad they thought the Ukrainian army were, and a misunderstanding that the period between 2014 and 2022, there was an awakening of Ukrainian nationhood here, which is played into this total war notion from the Ukrainian side, because it is a total local war from a Ukrainian perspective, if indeed it's existential, which they do believe it is. The fifth myth that he said we need to let go of is that armies are easy to create. They're not. And that may also play into the offensive at the moment, because combined arms operation is also not easy to create. Now, in terms of the theatre of war, I think the rear operations is being pretty good from a Ukrainian perspective, because in the theatre of war, the rear operation also includes both parts of the NATO battle space, where they are able to train both the combined arms operations combined arms training in Germany. And indeed, in the UK, there's a thing called Operation Interflex, where the UK leads 9 other nations in training Ukrainian soldiers from the sort of zero to hero perspective. And that includes Canadians. So there's 10 nations involved, and that includes, New Zealanders, Australians, Dutch, Finnish, Swedish, and Canada is part of that. So we do need to be cognizant of those 5 myths that we need to let go for the future. So what are we seeing in terms of changes that we need to kind of look at for the future? The first one, I think, is, where most of the audience that I can see at the top are white old men. And, Generation X and Generation Z are different than us. They've grown up with a smartphone, they've grown up with computers, and that really means quite a lot in terms of OPSEC and PERSEC. So one of the things which has become pretty evident is if you take your smartphone with you, you are going to die. So the way that we inculcate those who've grown up with this technology to be savvy in terms of understanding that if they illuminate, they will die. And what that means for OPSEC and PERSEC is absolutely vital for the future. I don't think it's a really difficult conundrum because people don't like being untethered from those sorts of things. The second thing I think we're seeing, which I vaguely mentioned, was that I do think there's this devolution of air power, or ISTAR, doesn't really matter what you call it, that notion that to see and know what's over the hill has become more evident. And I think that that will change how you structure the infantry in particular. So what does an infantry platoon or company look like now? Is every infantry company in the future, once it's dismounted, if it comes from a mechanized position, is it a UAV strike company equivalent? Is it a UAV recce company, which becomes a strike company? So those notions of how we work that with small micro drones being here to stay for the future is vital to look at for the future. The next one, of course, is that combined arms warfare is still relevant. There's a lot of guff at the start of the war that, you know, tanks were obsolete. But if you combine the combined arms element together, then tanks are not obsolete. There's a farcical notion in the same way that, for example, saying at the end of the First World War that the infantry must be obsolete because the infantry have taken millions of casualties. It's just not true. But really what we're seeing, of course, is JFC Fuller's theory of war, that for every improvement in some sort of weapon systems, there's a counter improvement on the other side. The advantage and disadvantage switches back between the offense and the defense. And that is really what we're seeing. I think what this means for Western nations at the moment is also that the deep battle matters. And certainly I think probably from a Canadian perspective and absolutely from a British perspective, we kind of took a number of capability holidays when we were involved largely in coin operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. From a UK perspective, that was articulated in March this year by our Assistant Chief of the General Staff, when he talked about this sort of 4+1 deficiencies in the British Army, and that was in electronic warfare, because we weren't facing that with the Taliban, in drones, in air defense, because the Taliban didn't have any air power, in fires, both in terms of rocket artillery and in tubed artillery. And the +1 was in terms of logistics in our sustainability. So, you know, I think we really worry, or I really worry about our kind of fight tonight capability. What can we get out of the door with tomorrow or the next day or the day after that? The other thing of how that plays in, I think, is that drones are probably the new counter-battery fire alongside the loitering munitions, which was part of that Nagorno-Karabakh aspect. It's absolutely the case as well that one of the surprises I kind of had, having studied the Russians for a number of years, is that it doesn't matter if it's true or not, that in terms of the so-called Gerasimov doctrine from 2014, I did believe that in the information age and how the Russians have been able to use disinformation and the social media these days, that the politics of force was the force of politics was going to be more prevalent than the politics of force, and that they could achieve their strategic objectives by subverting the West in a way that they couldn't in the Cold War. Now, that is an ongoing battle, and you see it really on the fringes, and you'll see it when this recording is placed presumably on social media, when there'll be some nutcases who say that I'm a warmonger, which I'm not, and that I'm talking absolute rubbish, which I might be. But the information age is here to stay. We've got to live with it, but we've got to understand when the bots are out there and they're trying to subvert things that are going. And there's a classic example of this in terms of the subversion of American policy and fracturing society, which I always like, which was in May 2016, where there was a Facebook group called the Heart of Texas, 250,000 members, and another Facebook group called the United Muslims of America, 320,000 members, all in Texas. Now, they met in some confrontation outside the Houston Islamic Center for a big punch-up. The Heart of Texas group were, you know, the secessionist group, White America, and all that kind of stuff. Both those groups were set up by the Russians from the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. So two groups powered by the Russians, and all the information was being put out by the Russians. So how this subverts democracy and hacks our minds is something that we need to be aware of in the future. In terms of how we are fighting this for the future, I think one of the successes from a Ukrainian perspective has been partisan warfare. And I always like here to quote Machiavelli, that the ruler who becomes master of a city, accustomed to freedom, can never sleep easy. So I think the Russians would have a problem in terms of trying to occupy and govern the regions that they're in. They are at the moment. There's large-scale partisan activity, but this is a ruthless genocidal regime. We've seen this before in the way that they've removed populations. So just because you've got partisan activity doesn't mean that if they see it as a vital interest, that things would not be bad in the future for the Ukrainian people. Now, I'm running slightly behind time, so I'll kind of finish there. So I started with Bismarck, so I'll close with Bismarck. Never trust Russians, because Russians don't even trust themselves.
Chip, thanks very much. I've got 3 pages of notes so far. I'm sure everybody else does as well. And I think we're starting to get questions popped up in here. So what I'm going to do is, this is sort of a future question. It's about positioning of nuclear weapons in Belarus. I'm going to call on Joe Howard. Joe, if you can, if you want to pose that question now.
Sure. Thanks very much, Qentin. Chip, good to see you again. A question and a supplemental question. The main question is, and I'll just read it, excuse me for reading, does the recent positioning of nuclear weapons in Belarus speak to a lower or higher probability of future deployment of nuclear weapons against Ukraine? And the follow-on supplemental question, if so deployed, what are the realistic options open to the individual powers that possess nuclear weapons, such as UK, US, and France, and to NATO as a collective defense regime? And if you want me to repeat that later, no worries. Thanks, Chip.
No, that's fine, Joe. One of the things that I would say here is that deterrence has worked. Mutual deterrence has actually worked. And I say that because despite the rhetoric of the Russians, and I see escalation from Russia in 7 ways. You can escalate either by weapons, targets, objectives, geography, domains, rhetoric, or manpower mobilization. Now, nuclear weapons, of course, come into either weapons, objectives, targets, and potentially geography. But mutual deterrence has worked. And I say that because despite the rhetoric of Lavrov and Medvedev, how many of the supply lines through NATO into Ukraine have Russia attacked? 0. How many countries that have aspired to join NATO in the last year, Finland and Sweden, has it attacked despite its rhetoric? 0. Now, that doesn't mean that we wouldn't have escalation and that things might not change. And the best thing to do with this, I always use, because I know him, he used to sit next to me at CENTCOM, was from the House Armed Services Committee on the 22nd of February last year with Scotty Berrier, heads the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, or did, I'm not sure if he's still there, one of the 18 intelligence agencies in America. Now, along with Avril Haines, ODNI, Primus Inter Pares in the intelligence agency, he made a grim assessment that Putin was likely to make nuclear threats if the war drags, reflecting Moscow's doctrinal views on the use of tactical non-strategic nuclear weapons to compel an adversary into pursuing negotiations that may result in the termination of the conflict on terms favorable to Russia or after the entry of others, when Russian offensive progress of its conventional forces looks like it might be reversed or the conflict becomes protracted. But I think the deployment by itself doesn't actually mean anything. And for example, Danilov from Ukraine has talked about absolute calm. To us, it's not some kind of news. And really, it then comes back into targeting. Because in terms of targeting, everyone's well aware that we talk about necessity, proportionality, and legitimacy in terms of targeting and distinction. But we would know in terms of imminency if this were to happen for 4 reasons. Firstly, because there would be specific nuclear threats from Kremlin. And I know in the last week, the dialogue on TV and propaganda in Russia has slightly shifted, but that again is a strawman, in my opinion. The second aspect might be if there's been a rout of Russian forces of which Putin has been personally blamed at home. The third one is the movement of tactical weapons from storage to the field. And at the moment, they've just built the bunkers in Belarus. They're not being moved into the field. And the fourth one would be intercepted SIGINT that suggests the intent to use them. So none of those 4 things pertain at the moment and don't. In terms of the responses, the realistic options, this would absolutely be a game changer in terms of the future of the war itself. Particularly also, not just from a NATO perspective, but from a Chinese perspective. Now, if you look at, for example, the Chinese 12-point peace plan, point 8 does use that thing, which of course the P5, including Russia, all signed up to again in January 22. Nuclear weapons must not be used and nuclear wars can never be won. We will not have a nuclear response should they go nuclear, but there would probably be a conventional response. And if there were a mobilized NATO conventional response, particularly in terms of the capability of American air power, if that were mobilized along with Western air power, the survival of Russian forces in Ukraine, I don't think would last very long. So although Putin may blame NATO, he doesn't want to fight NATO because the combat potential of NATO mobilized and the industrial base of NATO mobilized means that you're talking about David versus Goliath. I know David beat Goliath, but in terms of just sheer size and ability to bring combat power together, he would get absolutely malleted. If they were to use nuclear weapons, and you can dial a yield, of course, although General Mattis, I used to work for, used to say that there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. You can dial a yield, and you could the notion of either cities or combat forces being nuked would absolutely change the complexion of the war. So at the moment, I would say that the in intelligence yardsticks, that the potential for that use is still low. Doesn't mean that that doesn't change, but it is currently low.
Thank you.
Okay, Chip, you covered off the point about deterrence, which was an excellent one. And then one of the things you finished on or closed on in your discourse was about information operations. So how effective do you think Ukrainian information operations has been over the last couple of years?
I think it's been very successful, but I'm not fluent in reading Russian, so it depends what your audience is and who you're reaching out to and the success you see of that. And in lots of cases, what the algorithm is that either Elon Musk or someone else is tweaking there to see what information you're reaching. So the real answer to that is only those with the data know the significance of that. So it's Facebook, it's Elon Musk and all those kind of people. Now, I would guess that our significant, NSA, GCHQ would have the metrics to measure that sort of stuff and how it works. And I know I mentioned that sort of example of the heart of Texas and all that, but you only have to tweak the mind of a few people in constituencies, particularly in America. I don't know how it works in Canada at the moment, where you alter the result in 1, 2, 3 key states for an election, presidential election or whatever. You don't have to hack the mind of everyone. So your targeted information ops to do that is absolutely can be crucial if you're trying to erode democracy. There's a classic example again to the 2016 election when there was a 10 underscore GOP 10 the Grand Old Party Republicans in Tennessee, which again was a Russian Twitter folk that had more followers than the official party, Republican Party in Tennessee. And a lot of the stories that were being promulgated there by that Russian Internet Research Agency folk made it into mainstream media. So it's the way that those are picked up and then circulated. And that's how the sort of disinformation, misinformation kind of works. So those who know and have the data have always got to be on the alert. But, we all know that most of our folk who follow us on any social media are those who kind of are like-minded. So we've also got to be very wary of the confirmation bias that arises from those that you want to hear. So often it's good to get dissent, but you're never going to, or very rarely, you're going to change the mind of those people who dissent from you, particularly those from an ideological perspective. And that also comes down to, the reasons that people work for other people or believe this. It's the acronym of crime, compromise, revenge, ideology, money, or ego. You're working for one of those 5 things if you're working on behalf of a foreign government, either overtly or covertly, or just because you're ideological, either extreme right or extreme left. That's been one of the interesting things to look at, for example, in the change in Zeitenwende in Germany. So obviously because of the German history, and in the 20th century, of course, in particular, they always emphasize the futility of force over the utility of force. But there's been an absolute change in those who you might think are the least likely to change, so Green Party, who quite a lot of seats in Germany, because of the notion of justice and human rights and international relations. And if you have a genocidal policy and Bucha and Earp and all those sort of things, they're the ones who have changed, and their support for Ukraine has been extremely high, in percentage terms, up in the sort of 90s, where a sort of right-wing party like the Alternative for Germany, they've been the ones who see sort of, Putin as the sort of savior of the Western world against wokeism and everything else, and support is very low there. So they're the ones that Putin on the fringes will try and engage with through the sort of information ops to try and fracture some of the countries in Europe, because 3 things still pertain here in terms of support to Ukraine for the future: internal support in each of the Western countries, international support in alliance terms, and continued perceptions of Russia. Is it a good guy or bad guy? Well, to me, they're a continuing bad guy, and that's not going to change.
Right. So you talked earlier about the Russian theory of victory and how part of that theory of victory is that the West will get tired and stop supporting Ukraine. And the Russian info ops obviously are aimed at that kind of wearing down of Western will, fragmenting democracies, making democracy workable. I'm going to pass to Karen right now, who has a question about that that specific issue. Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't help but think that Putin was watching carefully when Biden pulled out of Afghanistan and was opportunist in his timing and confident perhaps that the West doesn't have that sustainability. We got tired of funding a war against the Taliban. Are there indications out there that the West will get tired of supporting the defense of Ukraine?
I don't see that at the moment. But if you go back to my last answer in internal politics, of course I worry about the election in America in 2024. Now, if you look at the collective humanitarian, military, and monetary support for Ukraine, it's Europe and the non-US West is actually just under what America provides. It's not, you know, this notion that the behemoth of America is up there and the collective efforts of everyone else is there is not quite true. But, you know, America's important, and we'll see how this plays out, because although there are lots of common positions across the Republican Party on things like they're united on crime and immigration, the economy, there is a clear choice in the candidates on, you know, Ukraine. You've got DeSantis and Trump on the one side, and what you might call the Reagan Republicans on the other side, with, you know, Mike Pence and Nikki Haley and all that kind of stuff. So that worries me a bit. I only take the notion of Afghanistan to a certain point, because, you know, most of my time, as you know, was from counterterrorism. In my last 10 years, we kind of achieved our counter-terrorist objectives, I would have argued, years ago, 2007, 6, 7 in Afghanistan. You didn't need to be there if your notion was, you know, we want to stop a significant strategic attack on the US, the West, or whatever. So the notion that you needed to stay forevermore was not proven. And indeed, I've seen nothing since August 21, which would suggest to me in intelligence terms that that is a threat. So it was right to pull out. You're also right, though, Karen, to, I think, say that Putin saw that as the West in decline. That was part of his narrative that, you know, this is a declining entity, that the multipolar world, which I want to be a part of, coming back to what I outlined in terms of the grand strategic and strategic objectives of Russia was there, but he got it wrong. I mean, none of that was proven to be the case.
Does that answer the question, Karen?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, great. Chip, jumping now, I know you're comfortable at strategic and the tactical level, and we talked a little bit about the tactical level when we got into the, you know, the lessons learned. Artillery is back on top as the king of war, the god of battle. Question from James Hennessy, talking about the latest Ukrainian counteroffensive. So how successful do you think the Ukrainians have been so far? And do you have a prognosis about the outcome?
I think it's slightly the wrong question to ask at the moment. And I say that because the first thing is Tolstoy's two greatest warriors are these: time and patience. So you can't look at major operations in terms of the news cycle and why haven't they broken through to Mariupol and Melitopol already. Now, it is, I think, from my perspective, what I call the, I'm just trying to get my notes, the triangle of decision for me is really in Zaporizhia, which goes from Tokmak at the top through the major arteries to Melitopol, Mariupol, with Berdyansky in the middle. So if you can take that, then and sever the land bridge, threaten Crimea, then you're somewhere on the way to success. So if these time and patience is the two things you have to really worry about, then I kind of look at it in terms of either the matrix for me is win big, win small, a stalemate, eroding stalemate. And within that, do you win slow? Do you win quick? And when does an eroding stalemate become a landslide? Now, you don't know when any of those things will happen, but they will come. And that is that key variable, you know, the intangibles, where it is tangible to count that you've taken 8 settlements or whatever, and you've got back 119 square kilometers. It is intangible to know when there might be, in classification terms, either a collapse of the Russian army, could be probable, collapse of the will of the Russian people, not probable at the moment, or elite defections in Russia, which lead to some sort of overthrow of Putin, not likely at the moment as well. Now, the Ukrainians, it seems to me, need to innovate to make sure that they're in balance in terms of those things I outlined with the sort of EW drones, the use of Havoc Hokums to really, be successful. And really, if you look at the defensive problem, the problem they confront in defensive terms, you've got forward line of own troops from the Russians, within a 5 to 25 kilometer wide defensive belt in large areas, with anti-tank ditches, then dragon's teeth, then your trenches, and sewed up with mines. Now, we all know that unless they're covered by observation and fire, they're just an engineering problem which you can overcome. So if what the Ukrainians kind of need to do is make sure that they, and I'm sure that there is this at the operational level that they're doing this, the Russians have to commit their reserves to ensure that they are going to hold the line. If they can make sure that those are retreated and still going after the deep battle about the ammunition and the oil depots and things like that, then there is a chance. But it's all those things that we don't really know about how is the precision guided munitions, the EW drones, artillery playing out in those battles at the moment. It's bloody obvious that you're going to take casualties. It's a really difficult operation, and combined arms operations on those sort of things are incredibly difficult. But we've had the Maginot Line, Barlev Line, the Siegfried Line. They've all been overcome. It's just not that quick. But be patient, use time. I think they'll be successful ultimately. When? Who knows? That's a variable in war. Don't give a time for anything. They always used to say that an economist will give you two things, a figure and a time, but not the two together. And that's really what I kind of always say. There are scenarios, there are never certainties. And that's why if you can do a linear thing which goes from A, B, C, and D, you're kidding yourself in terms of this. And the reason for that is war is the most complex thing going. It's easier to get to the moon, which is complicated. But war is complex because the human variable is complex alongside with the kit.
Great answer. So as much as the Russians were looking for sort of a France 1940 moment when they went in against the Ukrainians, and they sort of anticipated a political collapse, which of course Zelensky stalled, are you suggesting that we're looking for a 1917 moment in the Russians, that the Ukrainians really need to get the Russians attrited to the point where the army starts to fragment and collapse?
Yeah, I think that's one of the theories of victory. I mean, that's really the Kerensky offensive in 1917. 2 million people walked off the battlefield at the end of the day in that. And we don't want to overplay how bad the Russian morale is, probably, because tactical successes have a way of sort of making morale slightly better. But it might be worse than in Russia than it certainly is the Ukrainians. One of the things to look out for, there is this notion that the Russians are only, I don't know how true it is, and you don't know again how much disinformation there is, that Russians are only treating wounded officers and not treating wounded soldiers. There's nothing worse in terms of making sure that you debilitate your force than leaving wounded soldiers on the battlefield and not kind of looking after them. So I hope one of those things pertains that I mentioned. That's the Clausewitz in Trinity. That's the ideal. And again, it's an interesting one about, I think, conflict resolution and the future after the war as well, because the difference between the First World War and the Second World War, in a way, is that no soldiers, foreign soldiers, were on German soil after the First World War. Neither will there be any Ukrainian soldiers and certainly not NATO soldiers on Russian soil. Of course, there were in World War II. They're from both sides. that worries me again because of this sort of, if the Russians are defeated, and I hope they are, and what comes out of that in terms of a regime, whether you get a stab in the back theory that we were never defeated on the battlefield, but they withered on the vine and died and all that kind of stuff. Because at the moment you've got a very nationalistic Russia. There is no really pro-Western party there. Even Navalny is really a kind of Russian nationalist. He's never given a pronouncement that says, Ukraine are terrible, how they've been invaded and all that kind of stuff. So what does success mean in terms of a peaceful outcome for the future? And that's for diplomats to sort out, and is a wicked problem, I think, a wicked problem for the future.
A very wicked problem. I'm going to pass to Joe now. Joe, have you got something on imminent threat?
Yes, I do. Chip, just going back to your earlier answer, you referred to Article 51, which allows for the use of force in self-defense, whether at an individual or at a collective level, and I'm thinking of NATO. And the operative word in Article 51 is armed attack. So if we marry up the imminent armed attack phrase, can you envisage NATO somehow configuring a line of reasoning that if nuclear weapons were to be deployed only against Ukraine, that would nevertheless enable a line of reasoning to say, well then, by inductive reasoning, that is an imminent armed attack against any neighboring NATO state, which would then allow NATO to invoke an Article 5 response? Thanks.
Well, of course you could, and you could because if it was of sufficient magnitude and the radiation were to go sufficiently wide, which included, I don't know, Bulgaria and Turkey, you could conclude that were to be an Article 5 method. But you can on anything, because the whole thing about Article 5 is that war has no legal basis, so it is for politicians to say when war takes place. So, for example, DSAC 5 or 6 years ago made a case, exactly the same thing that you were saying, Joe, in a way, that a cyber attack of a sufficient size, which led to the deaths of people, could be deemed an Article 5. That is a political thing to make that decision. It is not a military thing. It is not a legal thing. So of course you can. So it's eminently possible, and that could be done. Whether you would get consensus or whether you'd have various groups which take it forward, I don't know. I think that you'd certainly go towards, depending on how widespread it was, some sort of no-fly zone being introduced. The thing that I would be worried about if I were a Russian nuclear strategist is one of the things that it seems to me has been pretty successful recently from the Ukrainian side with high-end Western kit is we've been knocking out all their delivery systems for nuclear weapons, Qentin missiles and those kind of things that they thought couldn't be stopped. So if you're talking about tactical nuclear weapons, I'd be worried, apart from maybe artillery, that your weapons are just not going to get there. Patriot missiles have been shown to be absolutely stunning at the moment. Whereas from a Russian perspective, one of the things that I've always argued, particularly because of the way that the Israelis have pummeled in Syria, is I have a real suspicion that there is major software flaws in S-300, S-400 air defense missile systems, which is, for example, that they have a big problem in IFF, identification friend or foe, which is why they couldn't discriminate and knock down the airliner after the Soleimani attack, why the attack happened in 2014. I think the Russian, if you're a nuclear strategist, I think you'd be really worried.
Thank you.
Chip, excellent stuff there. And that's tying in with a couple of other trends we're seeing. I was talking to one of the analysts today, and they were pushing forward the opinion that perhaps Ukrainians have started to target the dual-use artillery systems. So the 203s, anything that's capable of firing a nuclear shell. That, of course, leaves open the option of chemical or chemical warfare if the Ukrainians do break through. But I think it goes back to that initial question that Joe asked, is that, and you made the point that deterrence is working. Putin has been deterred from using nuclear weapons and deterred from escalating geographically. I'm going to close it off shortly. There's one question we're looking at here that we were talking about earlier. This is perceived as a European war by many people outside of the West. So what's your take on India, China, sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, yeah, there are various reasons to do with, colonial structures and the BRICS and all those kind of reasons why there is not unanimity worldwide. But if you look at the voting patterns in the UN, those who vote on the Russian side is tiny, and it's usual suspects. It's North Korea, it's Syria, it's Nicaragua, and there's one other, I think it's Cuba. Everyone else is neutral. So if the key thing really coming back to sort of Joe's questions in a way is, I think that they would all shift were it to go into any N word in the future. The conundrum for some of the BRICS nations, particularly South Africa, for example, is the ICC ruling. My understanding is that Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, has sort of declined an invitation for Russia to come to for Putin to come to the BRICS meeting in South Africa in August, because they would be obligated to arrest him. And my understanding is that they would were he to come. I think India would also peel away whether to be either chemical or nuclear weapons being used in the future. But the sort of global South, so-called, for historical, cultural, colonial reasons, is not same mind as we are, or I am, but from a moral and ethical perspective about what is happening now, not what happened in history, it's pretty poor. But there's cultural relativism. That is the way that the kind of world works. I wish it didn't, but it does.
There we go. Okay, Chip. I'm sensitive to the fact that you're 7 hours ahead of us. So I'm going to ask one last question and then and wrap up for the night. Does that work for you?
It does, yeah.
Okay, great. So Ken Barker, and this is a question about the scale of support that the West is giving. So you talked about the 4 conditions for success in land warfare: the air superiority, shock action surprise, recce pull. One of the deficiencies that the Ukrainians seem to have right now is aircraft and air defense. So both offensive and defensive air assets. So can you see a scenario where the level of support that the West is giving steps up to allow the Ukrainians enough firepower, enough combat power to actually win the war?
The short answer is yes. And the reason for that is, again, because of this mutual deterrence thing, there's been a gradualism from the West. Is that a Russian red line? If we cross it, what will happen? And the answer, of course, is nothing has happened at the moment. And really, I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Danilov who mentioned this, or one of the Ukrainian defense ministers has said that support from the West goes through 4 phases. Phase 1 is no. Phase 2 is let's talk about it. Phase 3 is let's train them. Phase 4 is let's give them the kit. That is actually what is happening at the moment with F-16s and Gripens. So, we know that 28 pilots, already trained pilots, I think, are going to be converted to F-16 shortly. We know that Sweden are going to train Ukrainian pilots on Gripen. whether you need more than one or two types, because again, I think most non-experts, and I'm not an expert in air, but of course you need DCA, you need AI, air interdiction, you need combat, close air support, all the sort of rubric across the piece of what an air force brings you, along with the sort of surveillance stuff from rivet joint and all those kind of stuff. So yes, we will provide that, providing it in a timely fashion. It would be great if it were there now for the offensive operation, because I think that's one of the caveats on why the Ukrainians aren't going as fast and as successfully as we would like at the moment. But it shows we're still in the skin in the game for the longer haul into 2024 and possibly beyond. Now, one of the things when I was doing stuff before the 24th of February 22, one of the scenarios I sort of said, two of the scenarios I posited then were a twilight war after some sort of either ceasefire or armistice, and the other one was a seize and withhold. We've got to be your territory, make some settlement now, otherwise the withhold bit is we still have this missile arsenal which we can keep pinging stuff around in perpetuity. So that could still happen from the Russians, but if they get the stuff that you mentioned there, aircraft and air defense, I think the air defense is there just about. It needs to be continue to be supported. So for example, when you Canadians last week said that you'd give $297 million, I think it was, or pounds, I'm not quite sure, of the currency. There was also another 1.6 billion from the Americans, which included more air defense missiles for Patriot and some new batteries. And of course, the Patriot batteries have come from the Dutch, the Germans, and the Americans, not just from the Americans. And it's been significant air defense from a significant number of countries. And I think they've now just about, but not necessarily in the forward close battle from the looks of things, have this sort of layered air defense, which you need, a sort of replication of how the Israelis do it at all levels, with all types of missile systems to knock all threats down. But at the high end level, the stuff they're knocking down with the Qentins and all that kind of stuff, I mean, that has been a significant success. And as I said, I'd be worried if I was a strategist from a Russian perspective, because their stuff might not get through.
Yeah, it certainly looks like the Russian kit is not as effective as we anticipated, or as the Russians had hoped. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there now, guys. We're 20 minutes over time. Chip, thank you so much for this presentation. It's amazing the way you can go from the high-level strategic and the theoretical stuff and bring it right down to the tactics and the boots and bayonets and the trenches. So I thank you for your time. I also want to pass on another blast from the past, Craig Bodden. Craig is out there and says hi. He's been popping up on the chat. So another of your comrades from 3 Commando. I'm going to pass back to Karen now to close out. And again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Chip, thank you so much for your generosity of time, especially given that it's, I think, 3:30 in the morning for you now. So we're grateful that you were able to come and share your insights with us tonight. And for all of you out there, this is our last presentation this season, our last speaker of this series, and we will join again in September 19. We're going to be hosting Arthur Kent, who will talk about his new book and the research that he's doing. And so we hope we see you then. Thank you again, Chip. It was a fascinating discussion.
Thank you to you all, and I had 2 great years in America. I love you all.
Thank you.
Did I say America then?
You did.
Sorry, Canada.
I think we understood.
Yeah, I better leave now. It's 3:30.
Thank you very much and good night all.
Good night.